Endangered Species Act was passed by Congress in 1973. Before it came the Endangered Species Preservation Act in 1966, which provided a means for listing native animal species as endangered and giving them limited protection. However, the ESA, or Endangered Species Act, is much more all-encompassing. The purpose of the ESA is to protect and recover endangered and threatened species and the ecosystems which they depend on. The ESA requires protection for critical habitat areas and the development and implementation of recovery plans for listed species. Under the ESA, species are listed under two main categories: endangered and threatened. Endangered species are defined as species in danger of extinction throughout all or significant portion of their habitats. Threatened species are species that are likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. There is also a third category, which are animals and plants that are in consideration for being listed as either endangered or threatened, and they're waiting to be reviewed and see if they are a priority. Now, excluding pest insects, all species of plants and animals are eligible for listing, and as of January 2013, there was 2,054 species worldwide listed as endangered or threatened. 1,436 of those were here in the United States. Species are listed based solely on their biological status and threats to their existence. Five main factors for species listing. The first is damage to or destruction of a species' habitat, which is a big one right now. The second is overutilization of the species for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes. The third is disease or predation. The fourth is inadequacy of existing protection, and the fifth is other natural or man-made factors that affect the continuing existence of the species. These are the five main factors that biologists and people working under the ESA take into consideration when they're listing species. Now, under the ESA, critical habitats can be designated for a species that is either threatened or endangered. Critical habitats are geographic areas that have the physical and biological features essential to the conservation of a species and that may need special protection. Critical habitat designations basically only affect federal agency actions or federally funded or permitted activities. They do not affect activities by private landowners or affect land ownership, allow the government to take or manage private property, establish a refuge, reserve, preserve, or other conservation area, or allow government or public access to private land. Now, sometimes under the ESA, they will buy plots of land and make it into a conservation area for a specific species, but it doesn't automatically do that. So if you're a private landowner and you're building on your own land and you find out it's a critical habitat, you can still build on it. It's only for federal agency actions. Now, recently decided that areas can be excluded if an economic analysis decides the benefits of excluding outweigh benefits of including it. So how does it work? Well, the ESA is enforced by three main federal government departments, but they work together with all other federal departments to make sure that other ones are following the rules of the ESA. The first is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which focuses on endangered animals. The second is the National Marine Fisheries Service, which focuses on marine mammals, and the third is the Department of Agriculture for plants. They enforce the ESA with citizen suits, imprisonment, fines, and forfeiture for normal people who violate it. They also develop and implement recovery plans that are unique to every species. And the Section 6 program provides funding to states, territories for species habitat conservation efforts on non-federal land. It also requires federal agencies to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service to ensure any actions they authorize, fund, or are carrying out doesn't jeopardize any listed species or their critical habitats. This is them all working together. The ESA also makes it illegal for any person or private public entity to import, export, take, possess, sell, or transport any endangered or threatened species. Take is a term listed in this bill that is defined as harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in such conduct as well as destruction of critical habitats. Now, like any bill, there are some exceptions. Some of these are incidental take by federal actions, national security issues, hardship cases, and the taking of endangered threatened species by Alaskan natives as it's part of their heritage and culture. Now, the penalties for normal citizens violating the ESA can range from a criminal violation, which is imprisonment and fine up to $50,000, a civil violation of a major provision, which can be from $12,000 to $25,000 fine, depending on if you knew what you were doing or not, and a civil violation of minor provision or permit regulation, which is usually like a $500 fine, and of course, confiscation of whatever you weren't supposed to have in your possession in the first place. So, a very main and huge part of the ESA to help recover animals, recovery plans. Now, these are designed unique to every species, and they basically outline the actions required to restore and secure self-sustaining wild populations. They are long-term guidelines. These things don't happen overnight. It comes in 3 phases. The first is reducing or eliminating threats. The second is restoring and maintaining self-sustaining wild population. And the third is removing species from ESA listing because they have recovered enough to no longer need federal protection, which is always the goal. Now, recovery plans provide guidance on minimizing threats to listed species, such as restoring and acquiring habitats for them, removing introduced predators or invasive species, and sometimes breeding species in captivity and releasing them into their historical range. Like I said, these are all unique to the species. Now, these are guidelines, not regulatory documents, so no agency or entity is necessarily required by the ESA to implement actions in a recovery plan, but they usually work together to try to make these things happen. There is a status review of each listed species and how they're doing, conducted at least once every 5 years to see how their population growth is doing and decide if they need to be either delisted, uplisted, or downlisted. Let's look at an example. The bald eagle. The bald eagle was once near extinction due to habitat loss and the use of pesticides such as DDT. What was happening was they were eating fish that were toxic with DDT, and it was causing the shells of their eggs to become very soft, and it was making a lot of nests not be able to make it. In 1963, at their lowest, there was estimated to only be 417 breeding pairs in all of the 48 states, which is not including Hawaii or Alaska. In 1972, the EPA banned DDT, which helped. In 1973, the ESA passed, putting many eagle populations under its protection, and then in 1978, they were all put under their protection, which meant that eagles' nests and habitats are now protected from any and all human disturbances. In 1997, the population numbers had increased to more than 5,000, and they were eventually delisted from the ESA, and they are no longer considered endangered or threatened. In 2009, there was estimated to be 72,000 individuals in the lower 48 states. And there's many more examples like this. The gray wolf, black-footed ferret, there's many more. So why is the ESA important? The ESA is an important landmark law that only supports the long-term survival and recovery of species who need help. It has prevented extinction for 99% of species under its protection, and has shown a 90% recovery rate in more than 100 species in the U.S. It has allowed the designation of millions of acres of critical habitats, which has shown to be a huge part of saving species. It's shown that species with federally protected habitats are twice as likely to be recovering as those without. And although the ESA is not alone, there are other important conservation acts, such as the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Wild Bird Conservation Act. It is one of the most all-encompassing and effective acts. Some success stories are the gray wolf, the California sea otter, black-footed ferret, American crocodile, and there are many, many more. So, recent news and changes. In 2019, critical changes were made to the ESA. The first is removal of blanket protections for threatened animals and plants. Basically, threatened animals no longer receive the same protection as endangered species. They're determined on a case-by-case basis. The second is that government officials used to consider threats that would affect a species in the foreseeable future, like climate change. Now they have leeway to determine the time period meant by foreseeable future and can only consider threats that are likely to occur in that time frame. And the third is removal of language prohibiting the consideration of economic impacts of listing a species. Regulators can now weigh the economic cost of protecting species and decide not to do it just because they would make less money. Climate change will be a less important consideration, and the revised rules really seem to clear the way for new mining, oil, and gas drilling and development in areas where protected species live. As greatly weakens one of our most important species conservation laws. So if you're as passionate as I am about it, you should go sign a petition today. Thank you.